The spiritual, physical and emotional wounds inflicted on Australia's First Nations people through colonisation continues to impact their sense of identity and belonging. Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia is an interesting anthology telling personal reflections from a wide variety of age, sex and locations throughout the country. 10 years ago, I probably wouldn't have selected it as the book for my assessment. However, since moving from inner city Sydney to the Northern Territory in 2016, I have learnt that the Indigenous voice is one that is highly marginalised, yet needs to be heard. There are many common themes throughout the book, including the importance and influence of identity, the stolen generations, family and kinship, education, concepts of country and place, and sport. There are so many stories of confusion and disconnection of Indigenous Australians not feeling like they fit in either world. There is a strong sense of imposter syndrome, especially those whose skin colour or features do not automatically identify them as being black. There is a wonderful line by one of the writers, Alice, who sadly took her own life before the book was published, where she says, "I never once felt ashamed of who I was. I felt displaced. White people didn't accept me as black, and I felt like only my family knew me as black." The theory of social capital is centred on personal identification in belonging to and existing within the bonds of society. For students like Alice, it was virtually impossible to feel included when they don't truly understand where and how they fit in the two worlds that exist for them. Don Bemrose has a similar story, yet tells it in a satirical way. Despite phrasing everything as sorry, the reader knows it is not meant to be a reflection of victimhood, but instead one of strength, pride and resilience, demonstrating the will to survive and the capacity to thrive against the odds. The unconscious bias that exists as to what an Indigenous person should or shouldn't look like invalidates their cultural identity based on skin colour alone, when it is something that goes so much deeper to the core of their very being. The disconnection and displacement felt by so many of the authors in the book stems from deliberate attempts by our white predecessors to eliminate the Aboriginal race. Racist approaches such as absorption and assimilation have directly resulted in creating these fair Indigenous people that are then forced to defend their Aboriginality and question where they fit in. A basic assumption of the assimilation policy was that Aborigines would eventually, and probably willingly, become like white Australians, in the terms of their manner of living, customs and beliefs. The paternalism and arrogance of such assumptions was further exasperated by the forcible removal of Indigenous children from their families, who became known as the stolen generation. Children do not see skin colour, nor do they see difference. It is something that is learnt from the society around them. They are genuinely inclusive by nature, which shouldn't be discounted. There is, however, still a very neoliberalist approach within the education sector, though it is not conducive to providing a rich education for all, nor an inclusive environment. Schools are not designed to be profit makers, despite the fact that they are run like a business in the modern day. And there is a significant financial advantage for Indigenous students to be attending schools, despite the fact that there is often no specific social and emotional support given. And the support that is provided regularly segregates and brings unwanted attention. There are stories within the book of students not attending school on the days that they know there are specialist Aboriginal events, as they are targeted with negative comments about their Aboriginality. Examples such as being told they are only receiving awards because they are Aboriginal, to disbelief that they are even Aboriginal at all. For Indigenous students, there is emerging evidence that deficit discourse actually works as a barrier by highlighting their perceived disadvantage. By bringing attention to their difference, it often brings shame rather than pride for some students, and has an exclusion effect rather than inclusion. There are a plethora of programs and policies that have been created in modern times, from the Mbatua Agreement, the Closing the Gap Report, the Indigenous Education Act, Northern Territory Emergency Response, and UN Declaration of Rights for Indigenous People, to name but a few. These are some amazing strategies to improve education standards and participation for Indigenous students. So how does that translate into creating an inclusive environment? To me, inclusion is all about students feeling like they deserve to be there and belong in the same way as everyone else, despite any perceived differences they may have. The normalisation theory is a principle that has merit. It means making available to all people conditions of everyday living which are as close as possible to the regular circumstances and way of life of society. In the past, inclusion is something that has been applied to individual students, often in reaction to external challenges such as behaviour. It has typically been focused on the disability or challenge of the child, rather than the environment, task and people around the student. What if we change the narrative on what is considered normal education and instead focused on approaches that benefit all students rather than just target individuals? What if inclusion was instead seen as the normal for all people within the school environment? What if it wasn't something we did as much as a way we all chose to go about our normal day? Rather than targeting specific students for inclusive programs, those philosophies could be applied to every student in the class. Instead of removing students from class for specialised so-called Indigenous programs and activities, what if they were made available to everyone? Take the 8 Ways of Learning philosophy, for example. This is a wonderful holistic approach that incorporates social and cultural factors into teaching and learning, which goes beyond cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity, and even cultural responsiveness. It is all about relational responsiveness, something which all students would benefit from and to respond to. By turning that approach into the norm, inclusion is generated both ways. For Indigenous students learning in a way that is familiar without being singled out, and non-Indigenous students being exposed to a way of learning that makes sense on an intrinsic level. Being Aboriginal is not a disability, and it shouldn't be labelled one, but the intergenerational trauma that has been inflicted can't be ignored. An inclusive approach that ensures all students, black, white or somewhere in between, are made to feel like they are the same, that they are part of the norm and not singled out in any way, even if it is with the best intentions. They need to feel a sense of belonging to their class, to their school, and to the society that they are part of.